Okay, let's try and unpack this. You've shared a fascinating stack of material, all focused on stakeholders.
Yeah, quite a bit to get through.
So our mission in this deep dive, really, is to take all these sources and just pull out the absolute essentials. We want to get a clear picture of, who stakeholders actually are, why they matter to organizations, and how different people see their importance, all that, but, well, without getting totally lost in the details.
Exactly. I mean, understanding stakeholders is pretty fundamental if you want to grasp how organizations really work and the complex world they operate in.
Right.
So we're going to dig into the core concepts that come up in these sources.
Okay, sounds good. So let's street it right at the beginning. Who exactly is a stakeholder?
Well, the definition you see cited most often, it goes back to Freeman, I think 1984, is any group or individual who can affect or be affected by the achievement of an organization's objectives.
Okay.
What's really crucial there is that it's a two-way street. They can influence the organization, and the organization influences them.
Ah, that reciprocity. And the sources, they point out that the complexity, how many stakeholders there are and who they are, it really depends on the organization itself, like its size, what it does.
Absolutely. Yeah. A small local shop is going to have a very different stakeholder map than, say, a huge global corporation.
Makes sense. The challenge just scales up.
Definitely.
Okay, so once we've got a handle on who they are, the material jumps pretty quickly into this idea of stakeholder claims. Why is that concept so central?
Well, because stakeholders aren't just sort of sitting there passively. They have demands, right? Or expectations, concerns. They want something from the organization. Could be about influencing the organization's actions or maybe addressing how the organization's activities impact them.
But figuring out what those claims actually are, or even, who is making them, that's not always straightforward, is it? The sources talk about direct versus indirect claims.
Right. That's a key distinction. So direct claims, they typically come from groups or individuals who have a clear voice, a sort of identifiable relationship with the organization.
Like employees or shareholders.
Exactly. Employees, shareholders, customers, suppliers, maybe trade unions. Their claims are usually pretty direct, pretty easy to understand, and communicated, well, directly.
Okay. And the indirect claims, that sounds like where it gets a bit messy.
It does, yeah. Indirect claims are often made by those who are, in a way, voiceless, or maybe unable to clearly state their demands themselves.
Like who?
Well, think about future generations, for instance, or the natural environment, or even sort of broader societal ideas. The issue isn't that their claim isn't valid,
Right.
but who actually speaks for them, and how do you interpret what they need accurately? That's the challenge.
Ah, okay. Like an environmental group saying they speak for a particular ecosystem. Or maybe a human rights group speaking for communities affected somewhere far away.
Precisely.
That whole issue of interpretation and who gets to be the legitimate spokesperson, that sounds incredibly difficult for an organization trying to deal with these claims.
It really is. The lack of that single, clear, authoritative voice makes it very, very hard to actually do anything with those indirect claims to properly factor them into, say, strategic decisions.
Okay, so we know who they are broadly, and we know they make these claims direct or indirect. How does an organization start to figure out which of these stakeholders matter most, strategically speaking? Or, who has the most clout?
Yeah, this is where frameworks like Mendelow's matrix often come up, especially in strategic analysis. The basic idea is to map stakeholders based on two things: their potential power over the organization, and their interest in what the organization is doing. So influence, broadly, is seen as a function of power times interest.
Right, so high power and high interest equals high influence. That seems logical. But what are the catches? What challenges do the sources mention with using this kind of framework?
Well, as you can probably guess, actually measuring power and interest in some objective, concrete way. It's incredibly subjective, really difficult. And the map itself isn't fixed. Stakeholder positions can change, sometimes really quickly, maybe because of some event, so their influence shifts. It's more like a snapshot in time, not a permanent picture.
Right, dynamic.
Yeah.
And the framework suggests different ways to handle stakeholders depending on where they land on this power interest map.
Exactly. So those with low power and low interest, from a purely strategic view, you might largely ignore them. Though the sources are quick to add, that doesn't mean you ignore them ethically.
Good point.
Then you've got high interest, but low power stakeholders. The advice is usually keep them informed.
They care.
Right. And even if they don't have much power individually.
They could team up.
Precisely. They might form coalitions, build alliances, and that can suddenly increase their collective power, shifting them on the map.
Interesting. Okay. What about the others? High power, low interest.
Those you need to keep satisfied. Their low interest means they're probably not paying much attention right now. But if something happens that piques their interest...
Watch out.
Exactly. Their high power means they instantly become very influential, very important.
And the last quadrant, high power, high interest. Top right.
Those are your key players, the most influential stakeholders. You need to manage them closely, engage with them actively, really involve them in decision-making.
It's fascinating how that framework tries to translate those power dynamics into a practical strategy. Stepping back a bit, though, the sources give us loads of different ways to categorize stakeholders. It's not just one big group you plot on a grid.
That's absolutely right. Looking at stakeholders through these different lenses really shows their complexity. A very common starting point is just splitting them into internal and external.
Inside versus outside the org.
Yeah. Employees, management, internal, customers, suppliers, competitors, government, external. Though some, like maybe trade unions, can kind of bridge that gap sometimes.
Okay. Then there's the difference between narrow and wide stakeholders, associated with Evans and Freeman, I think.
That's right. This view looks at who is most significantly affected by what the organization does. Narrow stakeholders like shareholders, managers, key employees, maybe really dependent suppliers or customers, they're seen as being more directly impacted. Wider stakeholders, maybe government, the broader community, they're less directly affected. And this perspective might suggest, a stronger responsibility towards that narrow group.
And Clarkson offers a slightly different take with primary and secondary stakeholders.
Yeah, Clarkson's idea centers more on dependency for survival. Primary stakeholders are the ones whose continued participation is absolutely essential for the organization to keep going.
Like without them, the business fails.
Pretty much. Secondary stakeholders, well, they don't have that immediate critical impact on the organization's basic existence. So Evans and Freeman look at who gets affected, while Clarkson looks at who the organization depends on.
Interesting contrast. Okay, what else? We saw active versus passive stakeholders mentioned.
Yes, that's from Mahoney. Active stakeholders are those who actively try to get involved, to participate in the organization's decisions and activities. Think management, employees, sometimes regulators or activist groups. Passive stakeholders, on the other hand, they don't usually try to participate in making policy, even if they have power or interest. That often includes most shareholders, maybe government bodies just doing their oversight role, or local communities who are simply affected by the company's presence.
Got it. And there's also voluntary versus involuntary.
Right. This one's about choice. Did the stakeholder choose to have a relationship with the organization? Voluntary stakeholders do like employees who could work elsewhere. Most customers, suppliers, shareholders buying stock.
They opt in.
Exactly. Involuntary stakeholders, though, they get affected without choosing to be. Think about local communities dealing with pollution from a factory nearby.
Or the environment itself.
Yes, or future generations, or even competitors whose market gets disrupted. They didn't sign up for it, but they're impacted.
And then a really tricky pair. Legitimate and illegitimate.
The sources stress this is super subjective.
Oh, absolutely. What counts as legitimate often really depends on who you ask, usually the organization itself. Those with a direct economic tie, shareholders, employees, customers, they're almost always seen as legitimate.
But
groups making claims without that direct link, or maybe without a perceived formal mandate, they might get labeled illegitimate by the organization, which basically means their views get ignored. While everyone might agree terrorists are illegitimate stakeholders, there's a huge gray area around, say, certain lobby groups or NGOs. Depends on your perspective.
Which links right into the next one, recognized versus unrecognized stakeholders, doesn't it? If an organization decides a claim is illegitimate, they're probably not going to recognize that stakeholder.
Exactly. They just don't factor them into the equation. And finally, the sources even bring up known about versus unknown stakeholders. Unknown. How on earth do you account for stakeholders you don't even know exist?
Well, that's the point. It highlights that organizations might not even be aware of everyone potentially affected by their actions. Maybe it's communities far down the supply chain, or perhaps undiscovered species living in an ecosystem that's impacted.
Wow.
The sources suggest this points towards a kind of moral duty for organizations to actively try to find out who might be affected before they act, or maybe adopt policies that aim for minimal impact. just in case there are unknowns out there.
Wow, okay, that is a lot of different ways to slice this. So you can see, looking through all these lenses, power, interest, dependency, choice, legitimacy, internal, external, it really highlights that a stakeholder isn't just one simple thing.
Definitely not.
Like an employee could be internal, narrow, primary, active, and voluntary all at once. Understanding all those facets gives a much richer picture than just one definition.
Absolutely. It shifts it from just a list of names to a really complex web of relationships, impacts, and expectations.
And sort of weaving through all this complexity, there seems to be this core ethical tension. The whole stakeholder versus stockholder debate.
Yes, this is probably the fundamental philosophical split that the material discusses. The stockholder view, and sometimes older texts use that specific term instead of shareholder, basically argues that organizations are owned by their principals, the stockholders.
The owners.
Right. And therefore, the directors, acting as their agents, have a primary duty, maybe even their only duty, morally and legally, to serve the stockholders' interests, which usually means maximizing their wealth.
So profit for the owners is the main, perhaps only, goal.
That's the core argument, yes.
Yeah.
The stakeholder view, though, takes a different stance. It suggests that a business exists within society. It's like a citizen of society. It benefits from society's structures, its protections, and so it has a broader duty. It needs to recognize a whole range of claims from anyone it affects, or who can affect it, not just the owners of the capital. It should act like a responsible citizen.
Okay. And tied into that debate is the question of why an organization would even bother engaging with stakeholders. Is it just strategy, or is there something deeper?
Yeah, this leads to that distinction between instrumental and normative reasons for dealing with stakeholders. The instrumental view is basically pragmatic, strategic. Organizations consider stakeholder views if and when doing so helps them achieve other goals, usually economic ones.
Like boosting the brand.
Or sales.
Exactly. Improving reputation, increasing sales, gaining market share. Stakeholders here are means to an end profitability, competitive edge.
So you might adopt, say, an environmental policy because it attracts eco-conscious customers and makes your brand look good.
Precisely. It's a tool for strategic advantage. The normative view, however, is grounded in ethics. It often draws on ideas from philosophers like Kant.
Okay.
It argues that organizations should address stakeholder concerns not because it benefits the bottom line, but because they have a moral obligation to treat every stakeholder with respect. Stakeholders are seen as ends in themselves, with inherent rights or moral claims. They're not just tools. That is a pretty fundamental difference in thinking. And the sources bring in Gray, Owen, and Adams' 7 positions as a way to kind of map this debate out, to see the different viewpoints along a spectrum.
Yes, that model is quite useful for seeing where different perspectives fall, from that really extreme focus just on owners all the way to much broader, more radical ideas about what an organization is even for.
Right. Let's walk through those 7 positions, starting at one end.
Okay, at one extreme, you've got the pristine capitalist. This is the pure stockholder view we just talked about. The only focus is maximizing shareholder wealth. Full stop.
Anything else is?
Anything else directors do that doesn't directly aim at increasing shareholder returns is seen as basically betraying their duty. It's like stealing from the owners. Social responsibility. Not the job of business leaders, according to this view.
Okay, crystal clear focus on owner profit. What's the next step along?
Then you have the expedient position. Now, like the pristine capitalist, their ultimate goal is still maximizing shareholder wealth. However, they're pragmatic. They recognize that sometimes dealing with stakeholders or doing things that look socially responsible can actually help achieve that goal.
Instrumentally.
Exactly. They might go green or donate to charity, but it's because it improves the public image, maybe reduces risks, attracts customers, things that ultimately make the business more profitable long term.
So CSR as a strategic investment, maybe.
Yeah.
Or a necessary cost.
Yeah, it's driven by enlightened self-interest, you could say.
No.
Moving further along, we hit the social contract position. This view argues that businesses kind of operate with an implicit license to operate that society grants them.
Okay.
To keep that license, they have to play by society's rules, the laws, the norms, the expectations, including ethical ones. If they break that contract, you think Arthur Andersen after the Enron scandal, society can effectively shut them down.
So behaving responsibly isn't just optional, it's a condition for survival.
It's seen as necessary to maintain legitimacy. Yeah. Next up are the social ecologists. They go a step beyond just fulfilling a contract. They argue businesses have an inherent responsibility to minimize the negative impacts they have socially, environmentally.
Just because they cause them.
Pretty much, just because their activities have that footprint.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if society is demanding it right now or if it's profitable to fix it. They have a responsibility based on their impact.
Okay. Less about external pressure, more internal recognition.
Right. Then the spectrum starts to shift towards views calling for more fundamental systemic changes. You get the socialists.
Yeah.
They tend to see business, especially large corporations, as a major source of societal problems like inequality and oppression because it concentrates wealth and power with the owners of capital. From this perspective, a lot of current corporate social responsibility stuff looks like, well, superficial window dressing, tokenism. They advocate for really radical changes to how businesses are structured and what their purpose is, so they genuinely benefit all stakeholders, not just prop up a system biased towards capital.
A call for a major restructuring of economic power, then. What about the radical feminists?
This perspective argues that traditional business values, things like aggression, competition, hierarchy, power over, are fundamentally rooted in masculine ways of thinking, and that these very values contribute significantly to many social and environmental problems. They call for a radical shift towards values often associated more with the feminine, like collaboration, equality, care, compassion, interconnectedness.
That sounds like a profound shift in culture and how things operate.
It would be. It would fundamentally change how global business works and relates to everyone and everything else.
And the final position presented, the most extreme.
That would be the deep ecologists, sometimes called deep greens. Their core philosophical belief is that humans are not automatically more important than any other species or ecosystem. They don't have some greater right to exist.
Okay.
So they argue it's morally wrong, indefensible, to damage fragile natural systems just for human economic benefit. From this viewpoint, our current economic and business systems, they're seen as fundamentally incompatible with truly recognizing the claims of all stakeholders, especially the non-human natural world.
So what's the implication?
Well, they suggest that a full commitment to all stakeholders, in their view, would probably require business as we know it to pretty much cease operating, or at the very least drastically shrink its scale and impact.
Wow. So that covers an incredible range of ethical views on who or what an organization is ultimately responsible to, from just its owners right through to the entire planet and future generations.
It really does. It shows how this seemingly simple idea of a stakeholder just cracks open these huge questions about the fundamental purpose of business and society.
So wrapping this up, what does it all mean? We've seen that stakeholders are, well, basically anyone who can affect or be affected by an organization. And they make claims on that organization, sometimes clearly and directly, other times indirectly, which brings up all those challenges of interpretation we talked about.
Right. And understanding their potential influence often means thinking about their power and their interest, maybe using something like the Mendeley framework, but remembering that measuring that stuff is tricky and influence isn't static. It can shift.
Yeah. And we looked at all those different ways to categorize stakeholders, seeing them through various lenses like internal, external, narrow, wide, primary, secondary, active, passive, voluntary, involuntary.
And even those really challenging concepts like legitimate versus illegitimate or known versus unknown stakeholders.
Then using those different perspectives, it helps us see just how multifaceted the whole stakeholder landscape really is.
Absolutely. It's not simple.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is that core debate running underneath it all. Is an organization only accountable to its owners, its stockholders or shareholders? Or does it have a much wider duty to society and all its various stakeholders?
Yeah, and we touched on that whole spectrum of views, didn't we? From the pristine capitalist focused purely on shareholder wealth, right across to the deep ecologist view that puts human interests on par with all other species.
And we looked at the different reasons for engaging, too. Is it instrumental, just a strategy for gain? Or is it normative, driven by a sense of moral duty?
It's pretty clear there's no single settled answer here. How an organization decides to view and prioritize its stakeholders fundamentally shapes, well, everything about it, its strategy, its ethics, its place in the world.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. This whole deep dive just shows there isn't one simple answer to who an organization should serve or why. It throws up some really complex ethical questions wrapped up in this idea of a stakeholder. So thinking about all those different positions we discussed, from the expedient view that sees stakeholder engagement as just a tool, through the normative arguments about moral duty, all the way to those more radical calls for fundamental change, where do you think an organization's main responsibility really lies? And maybe how would you even begin to handle a really difficult, fuzzy indirect claim like the claim of, say, future generations or the natural environment itself? Something to think about.